Have some sort of righteous indignation over this.
The Honourable Leanne Dalziel.
Mr Chairman, it's very difficult to follow on from that incredible contribution from my colleague. But I do want to follow on from him because I think he's absolutely nailed the core issue here. I was the chair of the committee when this bill that has taken such a priority from this government was referred to our committee on the 15th of February 2011. We set a closing date for submissions on the April Fool's Day 2011, and we received and considered 20 submissions from interested groups and individuals, and we heard 6 submissions. Mr Chairman, we heard the Regulatory Reform Repeals Bill was referred to the committee on the 17th of February 2011. The closing date for submissions on that bill was also April Fool's Day 2011, and we didn't receive any submissions on that bill. Mr Chairman, we were able to report this bill back in good time, and yet it has taken now until this date, and I'm not even sure what date we're up to now, 22nd of August 2012, and somehow this has become the government's top priority. And I think that my colleague has actually identified one of the major problems that we have with this bill. I've been at a conference today. The New Zealand Council for Infrastructure Development has had a very good conference today, and I had the pleasure of hearing Rodney Hyde speaking. And Rodney Hyde is, of course, the person whose name still appears on this bill because this was introduced by the Honourable Rodney Hyde. And he made some interesting comments which I think are very relevant to this bill. He said that when he was in government, he proposed that he should take control of all council budgets as the Minister of Local Government, but his cabinet colleagues were not as ballsy as him. And that was the description that he gave to the meeting today, and it was greeted with somewhat. It was greeted with a degree of incredulity. Is that the right word to use in responding to such a stage, an assertion that cabinet colleagues were not as ballsy as him to take all of the finance responsibilities off local government, because when we actually look at what this minister did in practice, he introduced the Regulatory Reform Bill that did what this bill does, which is very little indeed. And I think my colleague Clayton Cosgrove has described that very well. And so what we're seeing here is the government trying to push this forward as a major innovation in a number of areas, and yet we've had almost no examples from the speakers for the government in support of this particular piece of legislation. And of course, Part 1 amends the Agricultural Compounds and Veterinary Medicines Act 1997. Now, I actually recall that this was the part of the bill that actually attracted some of the submissions, and I think we actually heard a couple of those submissions because people were somewhat concerned at some of the amendments that were being suggested, which may in fact involve the Director General not being required to consult in a way that one would expect the Director General to consult. But before I come to the specifics of this particular part, I just want to comment on the position, on the point that was made by a number of those that submitted on the legislation as a whole, and that was that in many respects people were left with a concern that there wasn't proper attention being applied to the individual amendments to the particular pieces of legislation. Now, I actually reject that assertion because I think the concept of a regulatory reform bill, we called it a regulatory improvements bill, it's a very, very good concept. because what it does is it enables Parliament to deal with issues that may be vaguely controversial and so don't necessarily meet the test of a statutes amendment bill, but enables actually Parliament to remove some of the regulatory barrier, Mr. Chairman, that may remove some of the barriers to business growth, and some of the regulatory barriers to business growth on an integrated way rather than a piecemeal basis. Because if you could imagine that we were debating the Agricultural Compounds and Veterinary Medicines Act amendment bill, then it probably wouldn't have made it to the House, because the minister concerned wouldn't have been able to persuade his colleagues that that alone was sufficient to warrant a high enough place on the legislative program. And so what the Regulatory Improvement Bill, as we called it, the Regulatory Reform Bill as it was renamed by Rodney Hyde when he was the minister, in order to make it look like they'd done something different from the government, it actually is a good process to enable these things to be dealt with. Now, this particular issue, though, did raise some concern, and the concern that was raised was whether it was going to enable changes to be made to the recognition of agencies without the degree of consultation that one would normally expect under the particular provisions of the legislation. And so what the bill actually does is to enable the Director-General to recognise that person as an agency that is responsible for the management and carrying out of specified functions and activities, but it also gives the power for that recognition process to be overturned. And so the grant of recognition isn't a permanent grant of recognition.
Order.
I'm really pleased that the sound system has been turned off. And so I think that the point that I would make is that it also enables the suspension of recognition to occur. And no, I'm happy to speak without anyone hearing.
Technically. Give us a tune. Order. I'm sure that those people responsible for the sound system we might be back on again, are we? No. Are working on it, but I asked the House to show a bit of decorum in the adversity which we're now facing without amplification, and just bear that in mind. Leander, beg your pardon? I have no idea whether it's being broadcast. It's not being amplified. I can't answer that question. Leanne Dalziel.
Take a comment. Let's turn the lights off as well.
Order.
I'm afraid that the member across the House said that nobody was listening anyway, and I'm perfectly happy with that outcome.
Okay.
Because I don't actually feel that anyone is taking the issue as seriously as I believe they should be taking the issue. Because this bill does allow for the suspension of recognition of recognised agencies, persons, or classes. And I think
Just talk to someone who's listening to the broadcast, and
It's what?
the broadcast could be heard.
as a result of that, a responsibility to take it seriously.
Here,
If we don't
phone.
take these matters seriously, then there's no point in people making submissions to select committees. If they make submissions to select committee, then I believe this House has a responsibility to hear what they're saying.
Is this being recorded in any form, or should
advantage of that. So, Mr. Chairman, I'm not sure why one is looking at one that particular way.
Well, I can respond to a question which the member asked a moment ago. Is this being broadcast? The answer is affirmative. It's just the amplification that we're short of.
We've had word from people watching on TV that this isn't being broadcast.
Well, I'm talking radio.
Well, television is not being broadcast either.
doesn't have to be.
It doesn't have to be. Honourable Leanne Dalzell, you've got about 2 minutes remaining. You've got 2 minutes of this call remaining.
So the point that I was making was that the process of this legislation is an important one because it does enable us to deal with a range of regulatory improvements on a collective basis rather than on an individual basis.
Turn the lights off as well. Turn the lights off as well, then it'll be perfect.
Amendment may not have
You're working on it, Tony, at the moment.
when one's talking about a legislative program with the government. But what happens when you are able to collectivise them and put them into a single piece of legislation is it enables us to deal with them part by part within the context of a single piece of legislation. And that
Where's standing orders? What do they say about it?
I'm pretty sure there's no requirement for broadcasting.
Smile and wave.
Because we had it referred to us in February last year when I was still the chair of the Commerce Committee. And there were people who made submissions on this who actually expected that this process was being used in a way that would facilitate the passage of the legislation in a timely fashion. But this government's completely ignored it. They now don't put it on the agenda. They're not taking it seriously. We're not getting
So this is supposed to be broadcast when the House is sitting, but it's not a condition of the House sitting. The TV broadcast does have sound. So it's just on the TV broadcast does have sound.
Legislation, not only in terms of the individual parts, but in terms of the collective. What it represents as a whole.
Tell us the detail about the parts.
I've told you about the parts. It does give.
Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Simon Bridges. A point of